Fog swallowed the mountain market whole, and I lost my way completely. A woman's voice called out from the mist, low and warm. "You're going the wrong direction," she said, stepping closer. I didn't know her name yet, but I followed her anyway. Her cabin glowed gold through the trees, fire already lit. She handed me a blanket, and our fingers touched too long. "Stay until the fog clears," she whispered. I steadied on mine. I didn't know that night would unravel everything I thought I wanted. My name is Maren Ellis, 29 years old, raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a family that valued appearances more than honesty, especially about who I loved. I had come to the Blue Ridge holiday market that December weekend to escape a decision waiting for me back home, a decision I wasn't ready to make. Her name was Josie Calloway, and she ran the timber yard at the edge of town, her hands callous from years of honest work. She built up the fire until the small cabin filled with warmth, and she made me a mug of cider that tasted like cinnamon and home. I asked why a stranger would bother rescuing a lost tourist, and she shrugged, saying she couldn't leave anyone wandering in weather like that. We talked for an hour about nothing important, yet somehow it felt like the most honest conversation I'd had in years. When the fog finally thinned, she walked me back to the market, pointing out landmarks so I wouldn't get lost again. Before we parted, she wrote her number on a scrap of paper torn from a feed receipt and pressed it into my palm. "In case you get lost again," she said, and something in her smile made my chest tighten in a way I didn't understand yet. I spent the rest of that day wandering the market stalls, but my mind kept drifting back to the woman by the fire. That night, back at my hotel, I stared at the scrap of paper for a long time before finally typing her number into my phone. My text was simple, just a thank you for the rescue. But her reply came within minutes, warm and full of easy humor. We texted until 2 in the morning, trading stories about our lives, and I realized I hadn't laughed that freely in months. I told myself it was just friendship, a pleasant memory from a strange December weekend, nothing more than that. But when I drove back to Charlotte the next day, I found myself already counting down until I could see her again. I invented reasons to return to the mountains, a craft fair, a hiking trip, a need for fresh air, anything to see Josie again. Each visit peeled back another layer of her life, and I learned she had inherited the timber yard from her grandfather after he passed. She showed me the workshop behind her cabin, sawdust dancing in the light, and I watched her hands shape rough wood into something beautiful. In return, I told her about Charlotte, about my father's investment firm, and the polite, suffocating world I had grown up inside. I didn't mention Grant Whitfield yet, the son of my father's business partner, the man everyone assumed I would eventually marry. Some things felt too heavy to say out loud, especially when Josie's kitchen felt like the only place I could finally breathe. One evening she mentioned, almost carelessly, that she'd loved a woman named Delphine Hart for 3 years before Del left town for good. She said she couldn't keep living where everyone whispered, Josie told me, staring into the fire instead of at me. I asked if the whispering had ever stopped, and Josie laughed without much humor and said some towns never forget anything. Her own mother, she admitted, hadn't spoken to her in 6 years, not since she'd told the truth at a family dinner. I reached for her hand without thinking, and she let me hold it, though neither of us said anything about what it meant. Winter melted into a slow, unhurried spring, and my visits to the mountains became something I could no longer call coincidence. My mother started asking questions, wondering why I drove 3 hours to a small town every other weekend instead of staying in Charlotte. I told her I was researching a magazine feature on Appalachian craftsmanship, a lie that came out easier than I expected. Josie taught me how to identify oak from hickory, how to sand a table's edge until it felt like silk under my palm. We hiked to an overlook above the valley one Saturday, and she pointed out every ridge by name like they were old friends. Standing there, wind pulling at our jackets, I felt something settle in my chest that felt dangerously close to certainty. You're different up here, she said quietly. not looking at me. Like the city version of you is a costume you take off. I didn't argue. Because she was right. And the realization frightened me more than I wanted to admit. One rainy afternoon, stranded in her workshop while a storm passed, we sat close together. And the silence between us stretched taut. She reached up and brushed a curl of sawdust from my hair. And her hand lingered against my cheek a moment too long. Neither of us moved away. And when she finally kissed me, felt inevitable. Like something we'd been circling for months. I pulled back first, startled by how much I wanted it. And she watched me carefully, waiting to see if I'd bolt. I'm not looking to be anyone's secret, she said plainly. And I promised her, too quickly, that she wouldn't be. I meant it in that moment, standing in her workshop with rain drumming on the tin roof and her hand still warm on my face. We started calling each other every night, our conversation stretching long after I should have been asleep for work the next morning. I found myself smiling at my phone during board meetings, a habit my assistant Priya noticed and teased me about relentlessly. Josie drove down to Charlotte once, just to see where I lived, and I spent the entire visit terrified someone would recognize her. We ate dinner at a quiet restaurant across town, far from anywhere my parents' friends might see us together. She noticed my nervousness and asked, gently, if I was ashamed of her. And I swore that wasn't it at all. The truth was more complicated than shame. It was fear. Old and familiar. Wrapped around every decision I'd ever made. My father had built his firm on reputation and connections, and he expected his only daughter to protect both, no matter the cost. I hadn't told Josie yet about the unofficial arrangement, the understanding between my father and the Whitfields that I would marry Grant. It wasn't a formal engagement. Not yet. But everyone treated it like inevitability, including Grant himself, who called me his future wife as a joke. I kept telling myself I would explain everything to Josie eventually, once I found the right words, once I found the courage. Meanwhile, our relationship deepened in quiet ways. A spare key to her cabin, a toothbrush left in her bathroom, a life growing sideways. She started introducing me to her friends at the farmer's market, and I loved the easy way she said my name to strangers. I love, too, the mornings when sunlight cut through her curtains and she'd already be up, splitting kindling before the coffee finished brewing. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like myself completely, without editing, without performing for anyone watching. But every Sunday drive back to Charlotte felt like stepping back into a costume that no longer fit the way it used to. My mother mentioned wedding venues over dinner one night, casually, as though the matter had already been decided without my input. I said nothing, pushing food around my plate, while my father discussed the Whitfield merger like it was the only conversation that mattered. That night I called Josie from my car in the driveway and told her, for the first time, that I loved her. She was quiet for a long moment before saying it back, her voice thick, like the words had been waiting a long time to be spoken. I promised her I would find a way to tell my family the truth, though I still had no idea how to begin. Summer arrived, and we spent long evenings on her porch, watching fireflies rise from the grass like scattered embers. I started imagining a future there, in that small town, away from boardrooms and expectations, and the picture felt more real than anything I'd planned before. Josie began talking about renovating the guest room, careful and hopeful, like she was leaving space for me without saying so directly. I let myself believe, for a while, that love alone could untangle everything complicated waiting for me back in Charlotte. I was wrong. Though I wouldn't understand how wrong until the day Grant Whitfield showed up at Josie's timber yard unannounced. He tracked down my location through my assistant. Worried, he said, that I'd been distant and distracted for months. Standing in Josie's driveway, Grant looked between us, and I watched understanding dawn slowly and painfully across his face. Grant didn't yell, which somehow made it worse. He simply asked, quietly, How long I had been lying to everyone, including myself. I tried to explain, but the words tangled. And Josie stood frozen beside her workbench, watching her private life dissolve in front of a stranger. "You told me I wasn't a secret," she said after Grant left, her voice flat with a hurt I hadn't seen in her before. I swore I hadn't meant to hide her, only to find the right moment. But even I could hear how hollow that sounded. Grant didn't tell anyone that week, which I later learned wasn't kindness but calculation, giving himself time to decide what to do with the truth. I drove home to Charlotte with my stomach in knots, rehearsing conversations with my parents that I never found the courage to start. A month passed in tense silence between visits, Josie pulling back just enough that I felt the distance without her ever saying why. My cousin Regina, who had always resented that I was the favored daughter, somehow heard rumors and couldn't resist repeating them at a family gathering. My mother pulled me aside afterward, her face pale, and asked if it was true that I was involved with a woman in the mountains. I could have denied it, could have called it a rumor, but something in me refused to lie one more time. "Her name is Josie," I said. "And yes, it's true." And I watched my mother's carefully composed expression crack down the middle. My father entered the room mid-conversation, and when he understood what was happening, his face went cold in a way I'd never seen. He spoke about the Whitfield merger, about decades of reputation, about everything I was supposedly throwing away for a passing infatuation. I tried to explain that this wasn't passing, that I loved her. But he cut me off, saying love wasn't a strategy for survival. That night I called Josie, desperate for comfort, but she sounded distant, guarded, like she was bracing for something she already expected. "I've done this before," she said quietly. "Loved someone who wasn't ready to lose everything for me, and I watched her choose everything instead. I promised her I was different, that I wouldn't run." But my voice shook, and we both heard the uncertainty underneath the promise. The following weekend, Delhart, Josie's old love, returned to town for her grandmother's funeral, and Josie went to pay her respects. I hadn't expected the jealousy that flared in me, sharp and unreasonable, watching Josie stand close to someone who once knew her so completely. Del pulled me aside afterward and said something I didn't expect, that she regretted leaving, that fear had cost her the only real thing she'd had. "Don't make my mistake," Del told me, studying my face like she recognized the same fear she used to carry inside herself. I wanted to believe I was stronger than Del had been, but doubt had already taken root somewhere deep and stubborn inside me. Back in Charlotte, my father called a family meeting, informing me that the Whitfield merger negotiations had stalled because of personal complications. Grant, turned out, hadn't stayed silent after all. He told his own father, hoping to force my hand before I embarrassed everyone further. My father said, plainly, that if I continued this relationship publicly, he would remove me from the company and disinherit me from the family trust. I sat in his office, the same room where I'd once played beneath his desk as a child, and felt the floor tilt beneath me. I asked if he loved me at all, or only the version of me that made his business deals easier to close. He didn't answer directly, which was, in its own way, the clearest answer he could have given me. I drove to the mountains that night without calling ahead, arriving at Josie's cabin close to midnight, shaking from more than just the cold. She opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside without asking a single question first. I told her everything: the ultimatum, the trust fund, the merger. My father's cold, calculated silence when I asked if he loved me. Josie held me while I cried, but I felt something guarded in the way she kept a careful distance even while comforting me. "What happens when the money matters more than I do?" she asked finally, voicing the fear I hadn't let myself say aloud. I told her nothing mattered more than she did, but I could see in her eyes that promises alone weren't enough anymore. The gossip in her small town grew louder too. Neighbors whispering when we walked into the diner together. Some faces suddenly cold and unfamiliar. An older man at the hardware store refused to serve me one Saturday, muttering something about keeping decent company that Josie pretended not to hear. I watched her jaw tighten, watched years of practice patience hold her together, and understood for the first time what she'd been enduring for years. Josie's mother, informed by a well-meaning aunt, called for the first time in 6 years, only to repeat the same disappointment from before. Josie hung up the phone and sat very still for a long time, and I didn't know how to reach the place she'd gone to. Maybe this is just how it is, she said quietly. People like us, always paying for wanting something simple. I refused to accept that, but my refusal felt thin against the weight of everything closing in around both of us. My mother, meanwhile, began pleading with me privately, insisting I could keep Josie quietly if I simply agreed to marry Grant for appearances. The suggestion horrified me more than my father's ultimatum had. That love could be treated as something to hide in a drawer. I told my mother I would rather lose everything than live a lie for the rest of my life. And she wept, calling me selfish. Selfish, thought, was building a life around other people's comfort, while starving the only honest part of myself into silence. Doubt crept in during the quiet hours, wondering if I truly had the strength to walk away from everything familiar. Josie noticed my hesitation, the way I flinched whenever my phone rang with my father's number, and she began pulling away to protect herself. "I won't beg you to choose me," she said one evening, her voice tired in a way that frightened me more than any argument would have. I promised her I wasn't choosing anything else, but the promise came a beat too late, and I watched something in her eyes close. The distance between us grew that autumn, phone calls shortening, visits thinning, both of us circling the same fear from opposite directions. I hated myself for it, for letting my family's expectations create a wedge where none should have existed between two people who loved each other. Then, on the first cold night of November, everything changed again, faster and more violently than either of us could have prepared for. A spark from an old wiring fault caught the sawdust in Josie's workshop, and by the time I smelled smoke, flames had already climbed the far wall. Josie ran back inside for her grandfather's tools, the last physical piece of him she had left, and I froze. Screaming her name into the smoke, I followed her in without thinking, pulling my sweater over my mouth, and found her coughing, pinned by a fallen shelf across her ankle. Together we dragged the shelf free, and I half carried her out through the doorway seconds before the roof beam above us cracked and fell. We collapsed onto the wet grass outside, both gasping, both alive, watching years of her grandfather's legacy burn orange against the dark November sky. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and paramedics wrapped Josie's ankle and checked my lungs for smoke damage while neighbors gathered along the road. At the hospital, Josie gripped my hand so tightly it left marks, refusing to let go even when the doctor tried to examine her properly. "I thought I was going to lose you in there," she whispered, and I realized how close we had both come to a very different ending. My phone had recorded 12 missed calls from my mother by the time I finally checked it, panic bleeding through every voicemail she'd left. I called her back, and to my surprise, she was on a plane within the hour, arriving at the hospital before dawn, eyes red from crying. My father came too, though he said little, standing stiffly near the doorway, watching Josie sleep with an unreadable expression on his face. Word of the fire spread through the small mountain town overnight, and by morning, neighbors had already started a collection to rebuild the workshop. The same hardware store owner who'd once refused to serve me showed up with lumber donations, muttering an apology I hadn't expected to receive. Josie's mother called again, this time asking, quietly, if she could visit, and Josie stared at the phone for a long time before saying yes. I watched fear and hope war across Josie's face as she waited for her mother's car to pull into the hospital parking lot. Their reunion was awkward and tearful, full of 6 years of silence trying to compress itself into a single apology neither of them fully finished. I was wrong, Josie's mother said, holding her daughter's hand. And I wasted years I can't get back because I was afraid of what people would think. I watched them and thought of my own father, still standing rigid by the door, still unable to say anything close to that. That afternoon, Grant visited unexpectedly. Carrying flowers meant, he said, more as an apology than a romantic gesture. He confessed, awkwardly, that he'd never truly wanted the marriage either. That he'd been quietly seeing a man named Theo for over a year. I told my father about you partly out of spite, Grant admitted, and partly because I was tired of pretending too. I'm sorry it hurt you. His honesty startled me, and for the first time, I understood that I wasn't the only one drowning under my family's expectations. Grant promised to talk to his father about ending the pressure around the merger, saying two people trapped by the same lie deserved better than silence. With Grant's support, unexpected as it was, I felt something in me settle. A small, steady certainty that I no longer had to fight alone. My father finally spoke that evening, asking to see me privately in the hospital hallway. His voice quieter than I'd heard it in years. He told me a story I'd never known, that his own mother, my grandmother, had once loved a woman before marrying my grandfather out of duty. She told me once, near the end, that it was the biggest regret of her life, he said. Unable to meet my eyes, I stood frozen, understanding suddenly why family expectation had always felt like an inherited weight, passed down through silence and unspoken grief. I don't want that regret for you, my father said finally. Even if I don't fully understand any of this yet. It wasn't a full apology, and it wasn't full acceptance, but it was more honesty than he'd offered me in 29 years. I hugged him, both of us stiff and unpracticed, and for a moment the old distance between us softened into something almost like hope. Josie recovered slowly over the following weeks, her ankle healing, the workshop rebuilding board by board with help from half the town. I split my time between Charlotte and the mountains, finally telling my firm's board I needed a leave of absence to sort out my life. My mother, surprising everyone, started visiting the mountain town too. Awkward at first, learning to sit on Josie's porch and simply listen. The Whitfield merger dissolved quietly, without scandal, replaced instead by a smaller partnership that didn't require my personal life as collateral. Regina, my cousin, tried once more to stir gossip at a holiday gathering, but this time my mother cut her off before she finished a sentence. This family has spent too long protecting its reputation instead of its people, my mother said, and I had never loved her more than in that moment. Josie and I began rebuilding, not just the workshop, but the trust that fear and secrecy had worn thin between us over the past year. We didn't rush back into easy comfort. Some nights were quiet with leftover hurt, questions neither of us had fully answered yet. I need to know you'll choose this, out loud, in front of everyone, Josie said one evening, and I understood exactly what she was asking. I thought of the December market, of fog and firelight, of the years since spent hiding pieces of myself in different rooms. I told her I wanted to go back to where we met, to the Blue Ridge holiday market, and tell the truth in the open this time. Josie searched my face for hesitation and found none, and slowly, cautiously, she let herself believe I meant it. We spent December planning a small gathering at the market, inviting our closest people, refusing to hide behind vague explanations any longer. My father hesitated over the invitation for days before finally texting one word back, coming, which felt larger than any speech he could have given. Dell sent a card wishing us well, admitting she was proud of Josie for finding the courage she herself had once lacked. Grant and Theo planned to attend together, openly. The first time either of them had done so in front of our families. The night before the market, Josie and I sat by her rebuilt fireplace, the same spot where fog had first pushed us together a year earlier. "Are you scared?" she asked. And I admitted I was, but not of losing anyone anymore, only of not being brave enough sooner. She took my hand, callous fingers wrapping around mine, and told me courage wasn't the absence of fear but choosing anyway. Every single time. I fell asleep that night more certain of my own life than I had ever been in 29 years of careful, curated decisions. The next morning, snow dusted the mountain market exactly like it had the year before, and I felt the fog of my old life finally lifting. Booths lined the square exactly as they had the winter I got lost. Garlands and string lights glowing gold against the falling snow. My father arrived first, standing awkwardly near the hot cider stand, unsure how to hold himself in a place so far from his boardrooms. My mother found him there and looped her arm through his, murmuring something that made his shoulders finally drop from around his ears. Grant and Theo arrived hand in hand, drawing a few curious glances, though neither of them flinched or let go of the other. Del showed up too, standing a respectful distance back, offering Josie a small nod that carried an entire unspoken apology within it. Josie's mother arrived last, nervous in a way I hadn't seen from her before, clutching a scarf she'd knitted as an offering. I found Josie near the same spot where she'd once handed me a blanket, and my chest tightened with the same electric recognition. "You came back," she said, smiling despite the nerves clearly written across her face. And I told her I never really wanted to leave. I turned to face the small crowd gathered near us, my heart pounding louder than the carolers singing near the tree stand. "A year ago, I got lost in the fog right here," I began, my voice shaking slightly, "and a stranger found me and led me home." I looked at Josie as I spoke, watching her eyes fill despite her best effort to stay composed in front of everyone. I spent a year afraid that choosing her meant losing everyone else I loved, and I'm done being afraid of that anymore. My father shifted where he stood, and for one terrifying second, I thought he might turn and walk away without a word. Instead, he stepped forward, cleared his throat, and said, loud enough for the small crowd to hear, that he was proud of me. It wasn't eloquent, and it wasn't long, but it was the first time he'd said those words without a business achievement attached to them. My mother cried openly now, no longer hiding it behind composure, and even Regina, standing at the edge, looked briefly, genuinely moved. Josie's mother stepped forward next, wrapping the scarf around her daughter's neck, whispering something too quiet for the rest of us to hear. "I'm sorry it took a fire and a near loss to remind me what actually matters," she said, loud enough this time for us all. Josie reached for my hand then, steady despite the trembling I could feel beneath her calloused fingers, and pulled me a step closer. "I told you once I wouldn't be anyone's secret," she said, "and you never made me one. Not really. Not when it counted most." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden ring, carved from a piece of the workshop's original oak beam. "I made this from what survived the fire," she said, "because I wanted something between us that came from what we didn't lose." My hand shook as she slid the ring onto my finger, the wood warm from her pocket, worn smooth by careful, patient hands. I didn't have words steady enough to match hers, so I simply kissed her, right there, in front of everyone who mattered. The small crowd around us applauded, some crying, some laughing. Snow falling softly over all of it like the market was holding its breath. Grant let out a whoop that broke the solemn mood, and Theo laughed, pulling him close, both of them clearly relieved for us both. My father crossed the square and shook Josie's hand firmly, an old-fashioned gesture that meant, from him, more than any speech ever could. "Take care of my daughter," he said gruffly, and Josie promised him she intended to, for as long as she was allowed to. My mother hugged us both at once, murmuring apologies for years of silence she wished she'd broken sooner, for both our sakes. Regina approached last, awkward and stiff, offering a quiet apology for the gossip she'd spread the year before out of old resentment. I accepted it simply, without lingering on old hurt, understanding that healing sometimes arrives imperfectly, wrapped in awkward, unfinished words. The Whitfields, watching from a distance, offered polite nods, their disappointment over the failed merger clearly softened by their own son's happiness. Dell hugged Josie tightly before leaving, whispering that she was finally, truly happy for her, without any trace of old bitterness left. As the afternoon light faded, Josie and I walked slowly through the market stalls, exactly retracing the path from a year before. This time there was no fog, no uncertainty, only the steady warmth of her hand wrapped firmly around mine as we walked. We stopped at the same overlook where she'd once called me different, more myself. And I told her she'd been right all along. "I'm not wearing a costume anymore," I said, and she smiled, pulling me close against the cold mountain wind rolling down the valley. The lights of the market glittered behind us, and somewhere below, my family and her stood together for the first time, unafraid. I realized then that home had never been Charlotte or the mountains alone, but this, the courage to be fully known and loved anyway. A year later, we married on that same overlook in early December, snow falling gently as both our families watched, finally united instead of divided. I no longer fear getting lost, because I learned that sometimes the wrong turn in the fog leads exactly where you were always meant to be. Vandy.